Part 1, The Silent Night. The modest ranch house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, stood alone against a bitter December wind, its clapboard walls trembling under the weight of a starless sky. Inside, the nursery glowed faintly, a sanctuary of pastel blues and yellows where 6-month-old Ethan Harper slept in his crib. His tiny chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. A rhythm that was steady but fragile, his small hands resting limp near his face. His legs, though, were motionless, two delicate anchors of a mystery that had haunted his parents for months. No kicks, no wiggles, just a stillness that the best doctors in the Midwest couldn't unravel. Downstairs, the living room was a mausoleum of despair. Sarah Harper sat hunched on the threadbare couch, clutching a faded knit blanket she'd made before Ethan was born. Its edges were frayed, but it still smelled faintly of the lavender lotion she'd used on his skin in those fleeting days when he'd stretched and squirmed like any other newborn. Her auburn hair hung in loose strands over her tear-stained cheeks, her green eyes staring blankly at the coffee table where a baby monitor hummed its quiet vigil. Beside her, Michael Harper sat rigid, his broad shoulders slumped, hands clasped tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The silence between them was a living thing, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling into the cold. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a thread, as if speaking louder might shatter what little resolve she had left. "Every night, I watch him on that monitor, waiting for something, anything. What if this is it, Mike? What if he never moves again?" Michael exhaled, a slow, jagged breath that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. "We've got to keep fighting, Sarah. For him. We can't give up." His words were firm, a soldier's resolve, but his gray eyes flickered with doubt. Hope was a ghost in their home, slipping further away with every specialist who shook their head, every test that offered no answers. At their feet, a scrappy little Australian shepherd puppy named Rusty lifted his head from the rug. His coat was a patchwork of brown and black, matted from weeks of sleeping by Ethan's crib, his bright hazel eyes darting between Sarah and Michael, then up the stairs. Rusty had been a rescue, a last-ditch gift from Sarah's sister to bring some life back after Ethan's diagnosis. From the moment he'd bounded into the house, tail wagging like a metronome, he'd claimed Ethan as his own, curling up beside the crib every night, watching with an intensity that seemed almost human. Tonight, though, something was different. His ears twitched, his body stiffening, his tail still. Sarah noticed but brushed it off with a tired sigh. "He's restless again," she murmured. "At least he loves Ethan. I just wish love could fix this." What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet see, was that Rusty wasn't just restless. He was on the cusp of something extraordinary, a moment that would rip through their despair like lightning through a storm. The night stretched on, heavy and oppressive, the wind rattling the windows as Sarah and Michael lingered on the couch. Too exhausted to talk, too wired to sleep. Upstairs, Ethan slept on, his small frame cocooned in a blanket, oblivious to the pain-carving lines into his parents' faces. Rusty lay beside the crib, his gaze fixed on the baby, unwavering, as if he could sense something stirring beneath the surface, something no doctor's scan had ever found. Then, without warning, Rusty stood, his claws tapping softly on the hardwood floor. He paced tight, anxious circles near the crib, his eyes flicking from Ethan to the door and back again. His tail stayed still, his breathing quickened, a low whine building in his throat. Suddenly, he reared up, planting his front paws on the crib's edge, and let out a sharp, insistent bark, louder than his usual soft yips, urgent enough to cut through the house's silence. His nose nudged the bars, pressing hard, as if he were trying to wake something, or call someone. Downstairs, Sarah's head snapped up, her heart lurching. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice sharp with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Michael was already on his feet, nodding. "Yeah, that's Rusty. Something's wrong." They bolted for the stairs, their footsteps pounding in unison. Driven by an instinct they couldn't name, a cocktail of dread and desperate hope. When they burst into the nursery, they froze in the doorway, breath catching in their throats. Rusty stood tall, his paws gripping the crib, his bark morphing into a series of frantic whines. His tail gave a single, hesitant wag, but his eyes were locked on Ethan. And then Sarah saw it. Ethan's fingers twitched, just a flicker, so faint it could have been a trick of the dim light, but it was real. Her breath hitched, her hand flying to Michael's arm, nails digging in. "Mike, look at his hand." Michael stepped closer, his jaw tightening as he leaned over the crib. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice trembling with a hope he didn't dare trust. The baby's eyes stayed closed, his breathing even, but his fingers moved again, curling, uncurling, like they were reaching for something in a dream. Rusty barked again, louder this time. Nudging the crib with his nose, his body vibrating with urgency. "Ethan, buddy, can you hear us?" Sarah dropped to her knees beside the crib, her fingers brushing his tiny hand. And then it happened, his fingers curled around hers, weak but undeniable, a grip that sent a shockwave through her. She gasped, tears spilling over as she turned to Michael. Her voice breaking. "Did you see that? He grabbed me." Michael's hands shook as he gripped the crib's edge, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I saw it, Sarah. I saw it." For a moment. They were suspended there, the crushing weight of months lifting just enough to let them breathe. Rusty let out another bark, his tail wagging faster now, his paws tapping the crib as if he knew something bigger was coming. And then, as if answering the puppy's call, Ethan's whole hand lifted, slow, shaky, but deliberate, a tiny fist stretching toward Rusty. Sarah's sob broke the silence, raw and unrestrained. Her body trembling as she covered her mouth. Michael let out a choked laugh, rubbing his face with both hands as if to convince himself this wasn't a mirage. His hand, he's moving it. But the real shock, the moment that would sear itself into their souls, came next. Beneath the blanket, Ethan's legs twitched, a faint, fragile ripple, but real. Sarah's hands flew to her chest. Her breath catching in a ragged gasp. "Mike, his legs. Look at his legs." Michael leaned closer, his heart pounding as he saw it again, a subtle shift, a whisper of life under the fabric. "Holy, Sarah, he's doing it. He's moving." Ethan stirred, letting out a soft coo, and his eyelids fluttered open. His wide hazel eyes blinked up at them, sleepy but alive. Locking onto Rusty. The puppy barked again, tail whipping back and forth, and Ethan's hand reached out, brushing Rusty's fur. The shepherd leaned into the touch, nuzzling the baby's fingers as if he'd been waiting for this all along. Sarah collapsed against the crib, sobbing into her hands, her body shaking with relief and wonder. Michael sank beside her, his arm around her shoulders, tears streaking his weathered face. "He's back," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Our boy's back." For the first time in months, the Harpers weren't drowning in despair. They weren't lost in the dark. They were holding on to something real, something Rusty had seen coming when no one else could. The night that had begun in silence was now alive with possibility, a spark of hope ignited by a scrappy little puppy who refused to give up. Part 2, The Breaking Dawn. The nursery in the Harper house glowed with the first faint traces of dawn, the soft light filtering through the curtains and painting the walls in hues of gold and gray. 6-month-old Ethan Harper lay in his crib, his small body no longer a prisoner of stillness. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, his hazel eyes blinking sleepily up at the ceiling. But it was the movement, the fragile, miraculous twitching of his hands and legs, that held his parents captive. For months, they'd lived in a fog of helplessness, watching their son lie motionless. Trapped by a paralysis no doctor could explain. Now, in the span of a single night, everything had changed. Downstairs, the living room was abandoned, the baby monitor still humming on the coffee table. It screened dark. Sarah Harper knelt beside the crib, her auburn hair falling in tangled strands over her tear-streaked face, her hands trembling as she brushed Ethan's cheek. Michael Harper stood beside her. His broad frame hunched over the crib's edge, his gray eyes locked on his son's tiny legs. Beneath the blanket, they moved again, not just a twitch this time, but a real, deliberate kick that pushed the fabric aside. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, a sob escaping as she pressed her hands to her mouth. "Mike, he's kicking. He's really kicking." Michael's voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "I see it, Sarah. I see it." His hands gripped the crib's railing, knuckles white, as if letting go might unravel this fragile miracle. Ethan cooed softly, his small hand stretching toward the scrappy Australian shepherd puppy named Rusty, who stood on his hind legs, paws pressed against the crib. Rusty's black and brown fur was matted from weeks of vigil, but his hazel eyes shone with an unshakable intensity, his tail wagging furiously as he barked, a sharp, joyful sound that echoed through the room. "He knows," Sarah said, her voice breaking as she watched Rusty nudge Ethan's hand with his nose. "He's been waiting for this." Michael nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand, tears glistening in the dim light. He never left him. Not once. Rusty had been Ethan's shadow since the day he'd arrived, a rescue pup with a scruffy coat and a heart too big for his small frame. Night after night, he'd slept by the crib, watching, waiting, as if he could see something the doctors couldn't. And now, here it was, Ethan's fingers curling into Rusty's fur. His legs shifting with a strength they hadn't seen since before the darkness descended. "Ethan, buddy," Michael murmured, leaning closer, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and desperation. "Can you feel us?" He brushed his fingers against Ethan's foot, and the baby's leg kicked again, weak but undeniable, a movement that sent a jolt through them both. Sarah's laughter broke through her sobs. A sound so raw and hopeful it seemed to light up the room. "You're fighting, aren't you? You're coming back to us." Ethan's eyes fluttered fully open, wide and curious, locking onto Rusty. The puppy barked again, his excitement spilling over as he pawed at the crib's bars, his tail a blur of motion. Ethan's hand reached out once more, brushing Rusty's muzzle, and the shepherd leaned into the touch, letting out a soft whine as if to say, "I knew you could do it." "We need to call someone," Michael said, fumbling for his phone with shaking hands. "Dr. Kessler, he needs to see this. It can't just be a fluke." Sarah grabbed his arm, her green eyes wild with fear and hope. "Not yet, Mike. Please. What if it stops? I can't lose this." "Not now." Michael hesitated, then nodded, setting the phone down. "Okay. We'll wait. Just a little longer." They stayed there, rooted to the spot, watching as Ethan's movements grew stronger, his fingers gripping Rusty's fur with purpose. His legs kicking softly but steadily beneath the blanket. Each twitch, each shift, was a defiance of the prognosis that had crushed them, no cure. No hope. Prepare for the worst. The hours slipped by, the dawn breaking fully over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the nursery floor. Ethan stirred again, letting out a small whimper, a sound so ordinary yet so extraordinary it brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. His legs moved once more, a real kick this time, strong enough to push the blanket off completely. Michael let out a shaky laugh, sinking to his knees beside Sarah. "Look at him. Sarah. He's not giving up." Rusty circled the crib, his barks growing louder, more insistent, as if he were cheering Ethan on. The puppy leaped up again, pressing his nose to Ethan's hand. And the baby giggled, a pure, bubbling sound that cut through the months of silence like a beacon. Sarah's hands flew to her chest, her body trembling with a joy she hadn't felt in so long. "He's laughing, Mike. He's laughing." Michael reached out, his fingers brushing Ethan's cheek, and the baby's head turned slightly, his hazel eyes meeting his father's. "Hey, little man," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're so strong. You've always been so strong." Ethan cooed again, his hand stretching toward Rusty once more. And the puppy responded with a happy yip, nuzzling closer. Sarah watched, tears streaming down her face, as her son, her little boy who'd been trapped in stillness, fought his way back to them. "This isn't possible," she whispered, but deep down, she wanted nothing more than to believe it was. The morning unfolded in a haze of wonder and disbelief. Ethan's movements grew bolder, his fingers waving, his legs kicking with a fragile but growing strength. Sarah and Michael hovered over the crib, afraid to blink, afraid this miracle would vanish like a dream. "We should record this," Michael said, grabbing his phone again, but Sarah shook her head. "Just stay here," she pleaded. "Let's just be with him." Rusty remained at the crib's side, his presence a constant, his tail wagging like a metronome of hope. When Dr. Kessler finally arrived, summoned by a frantic call from Michael an hour later, he stood in the doorway, his gray hair disheveled, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ethan kick and giggle. This shouldn't be happening," he muttered, pulling out his stethoscope. "There's no precedent for this kind of recovery." Sarah's voice was fierce, protective. "But it is happening. Look at him." Dr. Kessler ran tests, his hands steady but his expression baffled. "I don't understand it," he said, staring at the readings. "His muscles are responding, weakly, yes, but they're active. This defies everything we've seen." Michael glanced at Rusty, who sat proudly by the crib, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "It's him," he said quietly. "Rusty did this." Sarah nodded, her voice trembling with gratitude. "He never gave up on him. Not once." The doctor frowned, skeptical, but the evidence was undeniable. Ethan was moving, laughing, living in a way he hadn't for months. As Dr. Kessler scribbled notes, Sarah knelt beside Rusty, running her fingers through his scruffy fur. "You saved him," she whispered, tears spilling over. "You brought him back." Rusty sighed, resting his head on her knee, as if he'd known all along that this moment was coming. For the Harpers, the dawn wasn't just a new day, it was a rebirth, sparked by a little puppy who'd refused to let the darkness win. Part 3, The Light Returns. The Harper house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, buzzed with a quiet, electric energy as the sun climbed higher, flooding the nursery with golden light. 6-month-old Ethan Harper lay awake in his crib, his hazel eyes wide with curiosity, his tiny hands waving in the air. His legs, once lifeless, a cruel reminder of a diagnosis that had shattered his parents, kicked softly beneath a thin blanket, each movement a small but defiant miracle. For months, Sarah and Michael Harper had lived in a shadow of despair, clinging to a hope that felt more like a taunt than a promise. Now, that hope was alive, breathing, and giggling in front of them. Sarah sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun, her green eyes glistening with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She held Ethan's favorite rattle, a bright red toy he hadn't touched since the paralysis took hold, and shook it gently, watching as his fingers stretched toward it, grasping with a determination that made her heart ache and soar at once. Michael leaned against the crib, his broad frame softened by exhaustion and awe. His gray eyes locked on his son's legs as they kicked again, stronger now, pushing the blanket aside completely. "He's not stopping," he murmured, his voice thick with wonder. "He's really doing it." Beside the crib, Rusty, the scrappy Australian shepherd puppy, paced with uncontainable excitement, his black and brown fur ruffled from a night of restless vigil. His hazel eyes shone as he barked, a sharp, joyful sound that filled the room, and leaped up, planting his paws on the crib's edge. His tail wagged like a storm, his nose nudging Ethan's hand as the baby giggled, reaching back to brush Rusty's muzzle. "You knew, didn't you?" Sarah said, her voice trembling with gratitude as she ran her fingers through the puppy's fur. "You knew he'd come back." Michael nodded, his gaze shifting from Ethan to Rusty. He never left him. Not for a second. The puppy had been their constant since the day he'd arrived, a rescue with a scruffy coat and a heart too big to measure. Night after night, he'd slept by the crib, watching Ethan with an intensity that defied explanation, as if he could see a spark the doctors had missed. And now, that spark was aflame, Ethan's hands waving, his legs kicking, his laughter ringing through the house like a song they'd forgotten how to sing. The morning had unfolded in a blur of disbelief and joy. Dr. Kessler, the Harper's pediatric neurologist, had come and gone, his tests confirming what their eyes couldn't deny. Ethan's muscles were waking up, responding in ways that defied every prognosis. "I can't explain it," he'd said, his voice tinged with frustration and amazement. "There's no medical reason for this. His nervous system, it's like it's rebooting itself." Sarah had barely listened, her focus locked on Ethan as he gripped Rusty's fur with tiny, determined fingers. "It's not medicine," she'd said fiercely. "It's him. It's Rusty." Michael had agreed, his voice quiet but certain. "He did something we couldn't. He brought him back." Now, as the clock ticked past noon, the nursery was alive with a warmth it hadn't held in months. Ethan cooed and giggled, his legs kicking with a rhythm that grew steadier by the hour, not the full strength of a healthy baby, but a fire that burned through the darkness that had once defined him. Sarah shook the rattle again, laughing through her tears as Ethan's hand closed around it, his grip shaky but real. "Look at you, buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're so strong. You've always been so strong." Michael sank to the floor beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own tears falling freely now. "He's fighting, Sarah. He's not giving up." He reached out, brushing his fingers against Ethan's foot, and the baby kicked back, a small but solid push that sent a jolt of joy through him. "That's my boy," he said, his laugh rough with emotion. "That's my fighter." Rusty barked again, circling the crib before leaping up to nudge Ethan's hand once more. The baby giggled louder, his head turning toward the puppy, his hazel eyes bright with a curiosity they hadn't seen since before the paralysis stole it away. "He's responding to him," Sarah said, her voice a mix of awe and wonder. "He knows Rusty's here." "He's always known," Michael replied, watching as Ethan's fingers brushed Rusty's fur again, the puppy leaning into the touch with a soft whine. "They've got something, some kind of bond we can't even understand." The day stretched on, each moment a testament to the impossible. Ethan's movements grew bolder, his hands waving with purpose, his legs kicking with a strength that defied the months of stillness. Sarah and Michael stayed by the crib, recording every twitch, every giggle, their phones filling with videos they'd watch over and over to convince themselves it was real. Friends and family trickled in, summoned by frantic calls and texts, their gasps and tears mingling with the Harpers as they witnessed Ethan's awakening. "He's a miracle," Sarah's sister, Lisa, said, her voice trembling as she watched Ethan kick. "I've never seen anything like this." "It's not just him," Michael said, nodding at Rusty, who sat proudly by the crib, his tail wagging like a victory flag. "It's them. Together." As evening fell, the house settled into a quiet hum of relief and gratitude. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, cradling Ethan in her arms, his small body warm and alive against her chest. His legs shifted against her, a soft kick that made her smile through fresh tears. Michael stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes soft as he watched their son. Rusty curled up at their feet, his head resting on Sarah's leg, his breathing steady as if he'd finally finished a mission he'd been born to complete. "You saved him," Sarah whispered, reaching down to stroke Rusty's fur. "You brought him back to us." Rusty sighed, nuzzling closer, his hazel eyes half closed but still fixed on Ethan. Michael knelt beside them, his voice low and thick with emotion. "He's our miracle," he said, glancing from the puppy to his son. "Both of them are." In the days that followed, Ethan's progress stunned everyone, doctors, neighbors, even the skeptics who'd written him off. His fingers gripped toys with growing strength, his legs pushed against the crib's bars, his laughter became the heartbeat of the house. Dr. Kessler returned with more tests, his notes piling up, but he couldn't explain it. "It's unprecedented," he said, shaking his head. "A spontaneous recovery like this, it's not in the books." But Sarah and Michael didn't need books. They knew the truth: Ethan's rebirth wasn't a fluke or a medical anomaly. It was Rusty. That scrappy little shepherd had seen something in their son when the world saw only a lost cause. He'd stayed by his side, night after night, his love a quiet, relentless force that somehow, impossibly, ignited a spark in Ethan's sleeping body. As Sarah rocked Ethan to sleep that night, the nursery bathed in moonlight, she looked down at Rusty and smiled. "You're our hero," she whispered, her voice thick with love. "You showed us what hope really looks like." Michael stood in the doorway, watching his family, and for the first time in months, he felt whole. The light had returned to their home, not in a blaze, but in the soft, steady glow of a puppy's loyalty and a baby's fight. Together, Ethan and Rusty had rewritten their story, proving that sometimes, the smallest hearts carry the greatest miracles. Lesson from the story: never underestimate the power of unwavering love and loyalty. Ethan Harper was trapped in silence, given up on by science, but Rusty, a scrappy little puppy, saw what no one else could: a fighter waiting to wake up. This story teaches us that hope isn't just a feeling. It's an action, a refusal to quit even when the odds are stacked against you. Sometimes, the smallest souls, like a determined dog, can spark the biggest miracles, reminding us that love can move what medicine can't. What do you think? Could a pet's love change your life like Rusty changed Ethan's? Have you ever seen a miracle unfold thanks to a furry friend? Share your stories in the comments, we're dying to read them. If this tale of grit, hope, and a puppy's heart touched you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Tell us where you're watching from and what kind of dog and human story you want next. Let's keep this community barking strong.